just the role that voting plays in our daily lives. So, overview of where we're going. I'm going to give a background on what is the California Voting Rights Act, the CVRA, prior attempts to challenge the CVRA, and then what are called safe harbor provisions. So if someone requests that a city move to district elections, what the city could do, and then what the process is like to transition to district elections if that's what the city ends up doing, and then some other alternative approaches. So as background, what is an at-large election? So most cities in California are at-large. That means all the voters vote for all of the candidates. So let's say you live in a city, there are 5 council members, all the voters would vote for all 5 of those council members. There's no requirement that a voter voting for a specific candidate live in the same district as the candidate, for example. Now compare that to district elections, and there are actually 2 kinds of district elections, from district and by district. So when we talk about the California Voting Rights Act and the request to transition to district elections, we're actually talking about this last one, by district. And so first, the from district required, you would essentially divvy it up as a pie. So then the top right, you have this little colorful pie. You would divide up the city into different districts. All the voters would vote for all 5 of the council members again, but each council member needs to reside in a certain colored district here. By district, however, is not citywide. Let's say each of those pies there were numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Only the district 1 and 3 voters would vote for the candidates that are residing in districts 1 or 3. And so every 4 years it would get staggered that way. And that's called a district-based election, but in the California Voting Rights Act, they just call it district elections. And so that's why I wanted to make that clarification. Now, the big picture is, nationwide, we have the Federal Voting Rights Act. And the question is like, who is protected? And so there are 3 protected sort of classes, by race, by color, and also by language minority group, which is defined federally as American Indians, Asian Americans, Alaska Natives, and Spanish-speaking minority groups. And so the Supreme Court case of Gingles v. Thornburg, decided in 1986, kind of sets forth the 3 major requirements approving a Federal Voting Rights Act. And then in layman's term, this minority-majority district is whether or not all of the minorities live in a compact area. So this is the proverbial, like, all of the minorities that are living on the other side of the railroad tracks, kind of that concept, right? And so the idea is that if you were able to draw a line where all of the minorities lived, they would be able to be geographically compact and they would constitute a majority in that district. The second requirement is that minority-majority district actually is politically cohesive and that they all generally vote as a block, as a minority block. And so if you were to separate that district, their votes would be diluted. And then the third requirement is that let's say all of the Spanish speakers generally vote for candidate A, and then all the non-Spanish speakers vote for candidate B. So there is a difference in who the minorities and the non-minorities are voting for. So in layman's term, let's say all of the Spanish-speaking candidates prefer Joe, and then all of the English-speaking candidates prefer Nancy, okay? So there's a difference. The California Voting Rights Act makes it easier to challenge at-large elections because it essentially removes the first requirement, that there be a geographically compact district that essentially all the minorities would be the majority. And then it also removes any requirement of discriminatory intent. Now, how do you determine whether or not there's a California Voting Rights Act challenge? You need to determine whether racially polarized voting exists. And so this is abbreviated as RPV. And on the right, you see this diagram, which is essentially is like this economic linear regression analysis, so statistics. And so you're looking at prior elections, you look and see whether or not the protected class, so here in our example, the Spanish speakers all prefer Joe. And then you compare how do the English speakers, the non-protected class, how do they prefer Nancy, right? And so you'll see this scatter plot. And so usually you would need to hire a demographer, a statistician, to be able to analyze prior voting patterns to see if there was a difference between the Spanish speakers and the English speakers' voting preferences. There are also other probative CVRA factors that are used. So if, for example, if that city had a history of discrimination, if they had other electoral devices or voting practices that either enhanced or diluted their at-large elections, if the candidates denied access to financial or other support. And then I put this jar of jelly beans because, in our sort of the ugly history of the US in the past, what happened, there are stories where African Americans would come, be ready to vote, and then they would be given a jar of jelly beans. And they would be asked, like, you have to tell us how many jelly beans are in the jar. And for some reason, all of the white voters would guess the right amount of jelly beans, and then the African-American voters would not. And so this is that history of discrimination. So in parts of the country, I think some of the comments in the chat talked about it kind of reflects the political climate of the region, the local reality of that area. That is something that is very real. And perhaps even in California, where certain cities in California also it reflects different political climates as well. But this is the question, do they have their own version of a jelly bean test, that history of discrimination? Other factors that can be used to help prove that an at-large election by a city is violating California voting rights. Is, like I said, other past discrimination, the effects of which are still here: education, employment, health, that continue to hinder participation in the political process, as well as overt or subtle racial appeals in political campaigns. And I don't know if you guys know Mr. Dunphy from Modern Family, but it can be that overt or it can be more subtle, but that's why he has that shirt. They were playing a family team, and each team was different colors. So, but obviously this is funny, not funny. One of the issues that came up for South San Francisco is that at the time that South San Francisco received a CVRA challenge saying that their at-large elections were diluting the votes of minorities, the city council was actually diverse. So the mayor, Liza Normandy, is Chinese American who took on her husband's surname. So she appears to have this quote unquote, white American name, but she's actually an Asian American. I don't know, I think now it's Mayor Carol Matsumoto, but then Mayor Pro Temp is Japanese American. She's been part of the council for many years. And then now, or I guess former Councilmember Gupta, who is no longer serving, but at the time he was, that they got the challenge, technically a majority of the council was diverse, but the CVRA does not look at whether or not the diversity is there today. It looks at prior elections. And so it looks at prior elections where a candidate of a minority candidate failed to win a council seat. It doesn't ask, the qualifications of that minority candidate. It just simply looks to ask whether or not there was racially polarized voting. And so here are some examples of challenges where cities said, no, we don't want to move to at-large election. We don't want to divide up our city into little districts competing against each other. We want to be one unified city, and we feel like we are honoring the votes of minorities. Those cities that have challenged it have almost all lost, and I'll share some very new few exceptions. But generally, like we said, there's a low bar for a plaintiff to prevail. You don't have to show that the minority group can form a majority district. And then there's really high costs for litigation fees. So the city itself would incur legal fees of upwards to, on average, $500,000 to have outside counsel defend them. But then on top of paying the city's own legal defense fees, the city would also be responsible for paying the plaintiff's legal fees if they were unsuccessful. And those plaintiff's legal fees have ranged from, $250,000 to $4.5 million. And then the real problem is kind of the impact is that the court ends up deciding the number of districts and drawing the map instead of having it be a public input process. And on the top right, you see a picture You see two white males. One on the top right is a gentleman by the name of Kevin Shankman, and his practice, Shankman and Hughes, is based in Malibu, and he is notorious for sending out these letters, these claiming that cities are violating the California Voting Rights Act. And in the bottom right is Doug Johnson, who is a demographer and also based in SoCal in Glendale. He's president of the National Demographics Corporation. So he's the one that's been doing all of those scatter plot graphs, trying to determine whether or not there's racially polarized voting in prior elections. So these two gentlemen have been in this battle, if you will, for a long time, usually on opposite sides. And so I just wanted to sort of just frame that kind of reality. In the past, what has happened is that because the cities have historically been losing, here are some examples of the settlements that kind of scare cities into transitioning to district elections. In Palmdale, the city ended up paying the plaintiff almost $5 million, Modesto, $3 million, Santa Monica, the range is estimated to be between 7 and 10 million. And then on top of that, again, there's the cost that the city spends itself to defend its own at-large elections. So anywhere from 2 million to perhaps, oh, sorry, I think I might have switched the columns here. Spend to defend. So I think Santa Monica, sorry, the bottom one should be switched. So Santa Monica was requested to pay 22 million. They spent $7 to $10 million defending themselves. So I apologize for that. And there are also very limited published decisions on California Voting Rights Act. So in Modesto in 2006, there's one case where the court found that the California Voting Rights Act applied, and Modesto had to transition from at-large to district elections. And then in Palmdale, there was also a case in 2014 where the court prohibited the city from certifying its results because it was an at-large election, which allegedly diluted the votes of minorities. Here's some other CVRA challenges in Huntington Beach in 2017. The city responded to Mr. Shankman's demand letter to transition, and they said that they were prepared to fight him. And then Mr. Shankman never filed the lawsuit, and to this day, he still has not. And then Santa Clara, the city of Santa Clara, did fight Mr. Shankman, and they ended up losing. And so even though the voters had chosen themselves to not go to district elections in a June 2018 special election, the court still ordered them to transition because it found that their at-large elections diluted the votes of minorities. Now, this is that exception I was talking about, and Claire actually was the one that flagged this for me. So recently, just 2 months ago, in August of this year, the city of Santa Monica actually won in that they prevailed in that, and Shankman lost. The court interestingly said that even if you were to draw the district maps in a way where the Latinx population were in one district, they would still only have 14% of the voting. Oh, sorry. If you put all the Latinx voters in one district, they would have 30% of the voting power, compared to if they were city spread out throughout the city, they only have 14% of the voting power. The court still held that there was no voter dilution because the results were the same. They still wouldn't be able to change the result of their council elections. And so the court wrote, at-large voting is not to blame, small numbers are. So that was interesting. We're still kind of, the dust may not have settled on that one. And then I talked earlier about this concept of safe harbors. We're talking, when we talk about elections, we're talking obviously about the vote for the president at the United States level, but we're also talking at these very local elections, which sometimes can really change how things are done in providing local city services. So in 2016, in order to cap a city's liability for potentially trying to defend themselves against a CVRA challenge, the California legislature adopted a bill that capped a city's liability at $30,000, but it put it on a very expedited calendar where a city only had 45 days to adopt a resolution declaring its intent to transition to bi-district elections, right? There's like 5 districts. Each of the voters from District A would vote only for the candidates from District A. And it would then give another 90 days after that first 45 days to have 2 public hearings to get input, and then another 2 public hearings to draw maps, and then to introduce and adopt an ordinance, which is a very expedited schedule. If you know anything about sort of city government, that's very fast. And so here's an example. This is the public hearing schedule for South San Francisco at the time. And it's just every week or 2, there's another public hearing happening. And this is on top of the already busy city council calendar. And so it just really takes up a lot of resources of the city to do it in a way that complies with the safe harbor provision so that their liability stays under 30,000, doesn't creep into the millions, right? And so part of the districting process is that because a lot of the cities felt like their hands were forced, they ended up moving to district elections. And the criteria for drawing those maps, so if you said you had 100,000 people in your city, and you had 5 council members, you would want to divide the city into nearly equal populations so that one person essentially has 1 vote and their votes aren't diluted. And race cannot be the predominant factor. And at the same time, minority voting rights cannot be diluted so that the minorities their ability to elect a candidate of their choice is preserved. So in that example of 100,000 people, I don't know what happened. Sorry. Jenna, can you see? I did something.
I can see your screen. It just looks like you need to
go back into present mode.
To present it, yeah.
Oh, yeah, I must have pressed something and automatically. Okay, how about that?
It's back to where it was.
Okay,
yes.
Sorry, thank you. So in drawing those lines, the question is, what do you use? So you can use the topography, some natural mountains, rivers, lakes, trying to figure out what would be a natural district. The geography would also include like highways, parks, railroads, sort of the things that are man-made versus the natural things in the topography. And then other things to consider are contiguity and compactness. So contiguity is that you could get in your car and drive from one part of the district to the other, right? There's not a gap you see in the non-contiguous part. There's no way from you to get to that southwest portion to the northeast portion. And then compactness is, how tight is it? If you could take, like that circle, every city were a perfect circle, you split it up into 5 equal parts of slices of the pie, versus if it's contorted, where the edges are kind of in weird, not smooth, and then versus if it's dispersed. Other things that are really the biggest, most helpful factor in drawing these districts is the communities of interest. So this is why there's that requirement for public input. So does it follow a certain school district boundaries? It doesn't have to. Does it follow certain voting precinct boundaries? Does it follow certain homeowners associations, in terms of groups? Does it recognize like a downtown area? Are there certain neighborhoods, right? So you know that from this block to that block, it has a cohesive feeling of one neighborhood. And this is interesting to keep in mind if you think about sort of the legacy of redlining and segregation too. So here are some other methods of voter dilution. So you can see this is up in the in Maryland, sorry. You can see where you can crack. There's this concept of cracking where you divide a minority population across multiple districts so that they can't constitute a majority. You can also pack a district so that you group a minority in one district, even though there are enough people and votes to distribute them among multiple districts so that you could have multiple minority majority districts. And then something to keep in mind is that in 2020, we've been asked to do the census, and after every census every 10 years, the district elections maps needs to be redrawn, because right now we're trying to, remember, we have to maintain that one person, one vote federal requirement. So generally this is like if you, all of a sudden there was a high rise with a large number of people all of a sudden becoming residents in one area, you might have to shift other parts of the city and redraw those district lines. And then there's something that's really important to distinguish is that the US Census is, I think this was controversial when it was being rolled out, was it counts the number of households, doesn't count citizens, right? Versus for voting purposes, for the federal voting, right, you know, usually you would have to be like a citizen to vote. Sorry, that's my alarm to remind me that we should start having discussion. But yeah, so after this census, when it comes out and the results are there, all the cities that have district elections will need to redraw their boundaries if there has been a population flux in one area to make sure it's distributed equally. In Riverside County, there are about 28 or so incorporated cities. And so I did a quick research, and it looks like a lot of the cities, about more than a dozen, so almost half are now by district. You see the larger cities like Riverside and Moreno Valley were already district because of either their charter or just because of the size. You see a lot of them transition in 2016. And then a few like Palm Desert and I don't even know how to pronounce this, I'm so sorry, Temecula are most recently, their first district elections is this year. And so if anyone can speak to that, if you're in a city that transitioned or if you remember, I would love to hear from you. But what we noticed throughout the state of California was that there was kind of a wave. And the southern cities got hit with these CVRA challenges first, and then it slowly trickled its way up to the Bay Area and then even beyond to like Sonoma, Napa area. And so that's why South San Francisco transitioned around 2019, and then, but their first one was it was 2017, so 2018 was their first by district elections. And so they'll have their second one in 2020. And then the most interesting one that I found was that Palm Desert doesn't have 5 districts. So generally a lot of councils, city councils are 5, 7, even 9. It's an odd number usually. And then, but Palm District only had 2 districts. They drew like a donut. And so, and part of this was they wanted to have the downtown area, that red, be they wanted the Latino population to be, a lot of it was, I think they have a 26% Latino population in that downtown area. And then they also wanted to do ranked choice voting, which I'll explain later, but it's being delayed to 2022 because there's a special software which costs $350,000. And during the time of COVID and pandemic that we're in, the city decides to wait on that voting software. And I found that really surprising, but then here is the map that Doug Johnson with NDC created for Palm Desert, and he shows how you can see if it's purple, it means there are no Latinos or Latinx population, but if it's red, it's 75 to 100% of that area consists of Latinos. And so that's why they ended up drawing only a 2-district map there. And so that's why I put those 2 maps, so you can see how they decided to do 2 districts, and that has been upheld as valid. So that they essentially tried to make the majority minority district in the middle. And so this is that concept of ranked choice voting that Palm Desert has also had deferred. The idea is that you would rank from 1 through 6 instead of having each district choose their candidate. This would allow you to rank your candidate choices. And then this is another alternative to ranked choice voting, or the default choice, and it's called cumulative voting. So let's say you have 3 council members or 5, and you would take your 3 votes and you could give them all to one person, right? You could vote for Leroy Left 3 times, or you could distribute them amongst different candidates. So these are alternative approaches that require county wide support and implementation, and therefore special software. So I will stop at this point and I'll end my screen share so that way we can open it up for discussion. If you've had some experience participating in these public hearings, or if you come from a city that transitioned to district elections, would love to hear from you, but otherwise just any questions you might have. And I think I've stopped my sharing. Jenna, is that?
You did.
Okay.
You did stop.
Okay.
And there was no questions in the chat throughout your
okay.
presentation. And I did want to add, for when you were discussing districting, that was also another topic that was covered in Our Time Is Now, is how Georgia drew the district lines. And there was some, I think, where they were doing like non-contiguous and moving some stuff around so that they could get the votes that they wanted.
Yeah, so how those lines are drawn really can make a difference. Yeah, and it's interesting how with San Francisco just being part of that public hearing process, how the originally there was this, when you get a CVRA challenge, you feel it's implicitly they're saying like, hey city, we think you're racist, right? Your current practices are racist and they're diluting the votes of minorities. But it's hard because when you have a diverse council, they're like, but we're trying to encourage diversity. We are diverse. So it's this interesting, it doesn't match with the reality. And I do, just on a personal feeling, I feel like the law needs to be written in a different way, because in a place like Georgia or Mississippi or Tennessee, where I grew up, there is pretty much just, there's a large white population, and there's a large African American population. And so it makes sense but in California, we have so many different minorities that I worry that the California Voting Rights Act, as drafted, kind of pits different minority groups against each other. So like the Spanish speaking versus the quote unquote Asians could vote for different candidates. And so it doesn't lump all the minorities in one group. It separates them by their different language, race, or color. And so I worry that how it's being done in California isn't actually contributing to more voter empowerment of minority voices, if that makes sense.
So a question did come through. It says, do you have an idea of how the court ruling to end census data collection will impact the district boundaries?
So the boundaries only look at the number of populations based on the census. So however that input is done affects the population, right? That one vote, one person. So I'm not actually sure. But if it counts more people, then it would have to readjust the boundaries. But on a local level, at your council level, whenever they're redrawing the districts, you can attend those public hearings and say, I'm really concerned that this part of District 5 actually should be part of District 2 because all of the people in that neighborhood go to the same church or something like that. And so I think there is a level of local input that is really important to also remember, even on top of like the census population counts. But yeah, it would have a ripple effect, because even how the California Voting Rights Act, it refers to the federal census.
I don't have a question, but I just was thinking back to the slide that was about, I think if they got the CVR challenge, when they had like the expedited meetings that they had to do. And like, I also used to work for the City of Riverside library system. And so I've been to like a few council meetings. So it's just like amazing to me that you have to push that through in such a short amount of time. Because like you said, like working for the government or in local government too, it just is very slow to make changes. And this is like super expedited.
Yeah, there are pros and cons of that, right? So I think in 2017 also, I should mention that, sorry, we have like 6 more minutes still, so I just want to be mindful of everyone's time. I have a timer on myself. Was that it really is, there's, in 2017, there was a bill that was passed that allows the city to engage in a voluntary private agreement with the attorney or the organization that filed the, or is putting forth this challenge, to extend those deadlines. So that helps give the city some breathing space, but it still is dependent on whether or not like Shankman is going to give it to you. Like if he thinks that he might want to force your hand to push it through quicker. And as soon as South San Francisco transitioned to district elections, passed that final ordinance and was adopted, boom, we got a letter from Shankman for $30,000. And I asked another colleague from another city like that had also transitioned, oh, is this letter, like, what did your letter look like? It was identical to the T. Like everything was identical except for the dates. That was it. And so it was just, it was really frustrating because I think obviously there are wonderful organizations like the Mexican American Legal Defense Education Fund and AACP that are also filing these CVRA challenges. But for it to have like a white male from Malibu, collecting $30,000 on these really is kind of personally, it feels there's something wrong about it. And so I think that's just sort of kind of the background of, I think there needs to be a legislative fix to the CVRA though, make it really have a meaningful effect. And it's still, I think the jury's out on whether or not cities that transition to district elections actually see a more diverse city council. I think we're still trying to see if that's actually true. Like theoretically it should be, but I don't actually know if that's translating into practice. And I think that's what the Santa Monica decision is kind of hinting at.
Yeah, I think when I was doing some extra research, it was saying that Shankman, as like the plaintiff, when he won cases, his plaintiff's fees are also paid for. So it seems like there's like a money incentive to be starting these lawsuits.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I don't see any other. There is another question. Considering the current political climate, do you anticipate or foresee more cases on CVRA challenges?
Definitely. I think it's on people's radars. I think one of the issues is that Shankman has done a very good job with getting a lot of cities to transition. So there aren't that many left, I think, to go after. And you also really do have to have some data about, whether or not prior elections had racially polarized voting. So some cities may not ever transition because what that requires is that there was a prior election where there was a minority candidate that tried to become a council member and they didn't, right? And so if you have that data point, then you would do all the statistical analysis. But if no minority candidate has ever run for council, so think of like a wealthy area in like Napa or Sonoma County, and even though there are a lot of laborers that are Spanish speaking, they might not have the resources or political wherewithal to want to run for city council. So then you wouldn't have a prior election, that data point that you need to do racially polarized voting analysis. So it's interesting how, there's a little bit of a catch there.
I was also doing research to do like a comparison contrast versus California and Georgia, and it does not look like they have an equivalent to the California Voting Rights Act. It looks like in their Georgia code, it's just from the federal, and it's also very hard to try to navigate through. But it just does not look like they have something in place like we do here in California.
Yeah, so that means then, right, the default for the Federal Voting Rights Act is that essentially all of the African Americans live in one geographically compact area. So imagine a city that is, like most cities in the US are segregated. You should read Richard Rothstein's The Color of the Law, or The Color of Law. But for those areas that are quote unquote integrated, that means they wouldn't be subject to a possible Federal Voting Rights Act challenge, because let's say if all the African Americans are dispersed throughout the entire city, right, naturally, because, like there weren't segregated blocks of the city, then it wouldn't be ripe for a Federal Voting Rights Act challenge.
I recall another effect too is that the book was saying that in districts that were like majority white, they had more polling places, and in the minority and even lower income places, they had less polling. So when I mentioned that the wait to vote was 5 hours long, that was in the lower income areas, and like majority of like African Americans or other minorities were in those voting areas. And so I think like that districting too, if you district your county or your state by like, oh, all the rich, like high income people will be here and low income will be here, you can like make those divisions. And also like speaking into like mostly like minority groups are in the low income bracket because of other like systemic issues. So you can say that you're not doing it because it's racist, but then even doing it by like income is inherently racist as well.
That's right. Yeah.
So it is 1 o'clock and I do not see any other questions. And so we want to be respectful of people's times. So I am putting my email in the chat. I'm putting in, for those of you that are attorneys, I've made a SurveyMonkey link to take a survey of what types of MCLE topics that you would like to see in the future. And then I again put the link to the Google Doc that I made, the handout that I made for this session that had the cases from Our Time Is Now. You can also check out the ebook from our Lexis Digital Library, which is a really exciting new service that we have. So it's ebooks, and so we have just one copy of the ebook available. So if someone has it, you'll have to place a hold on it and wait for it. And for more information about our digital library, I'm putting that here. Someone thanked you, Claire thanked you for a brilliant presentation. So thank you for attending. On that, I'll say thank you for attending our MCLE book talk today. I hope that it was informative and inspiring. Thank you, Naree, for agreeing to present on this topic. I really appreciate your time and your expertise, and it just was really just so much information, and I think it just really makes me want. I've already voted, but like if I could vote again, I would go out and vote again. So yes, go out and vote. And for those of you who are getting MCLE credit, I will be sending out an email later with the MCLE credit, and I'm also going to send out to everyone an evaluation. The evaluation is just helpful for me to see what we can do better and what worked well for our presentations. So again, I put my email in the chat, and Naree also shared her email. So I will hang around a bit so that you can get information out of the chat, but the presentation is concluded, and thank you all for attending. And thank you again, Naree. It was a pleasure, and maybe we can work together in the future.
Of course. Thank you for organizing everything. Thanks everyone for attending.
Thank you.